Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. We are now going to begin our Poetry of Science discussion. First, we have Kai Alexis Smith introducing.
Hello, my name is Kai Alexis Smith. I'm the Architecture and Planning Librarian and Roach Library Gallery Manager at MIT Libraries. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the exhibit and the gallery. So also back up, it's an honor and a pleasure to be able to introduce and be a part of this. And I'm thank you for asking me to do this. So Roach Library Gallery is within the Roach Library, which is a part of the MIT Library system. It's located on the Massachusetts Avenue side of campus. Exhibits in this gallery focus on interdisciplinary art practices, works that push creative intellectual boundaries and support research. So my advocacy around efforts to make the space more inviting for students of color, and I'm also very intentional about booking shows that have more representation in the gallery's artists and works that tie, and all of this work ties into the MIT Library's mission and values, which is to pursue social justice and an ethic of care. So when Joshua reached out to me about the exhibit at Roach Library Gallery, it was just perfect. The Poetry of Science exhibit, it was actually our first show post reopening the libraries post-pandemic. Well, there's no post-pandemic, but when we were able to reopen the libraries, and it was really exciting. So the Poetry of Science exhibit marries positive associations with science, nature, and art, and has attracted viewers from, in the time it's been up, viewers from literally all over campus. We've had students from this, talk to me about the exhibit from sciences, urban planning, art history, and architecture, just to name a few. So far, everything's been really positive, and I've seen a lot more students of color coming to the library and excited about the artwork. So I am very, I'm thrilled to have had it in the space, and it is up until February 28th, a couple more days. So if you can get a TIM ticket to come to campus, please come through and see it while it's still up in the space. And I think I'm ready to hand this over then to, is it Joshua?
Yes.
All right.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
No
Thank you so much. If you'd like to take a look at some of these pictures, I can share that if you wouldn't mind, Dan. Is that possible?
Yep, it's done.
So these are the images from the Poetry of Science. So quickly, before I move into more detail about our amazing panelists that are here today, the Poetry of Science is a project that's supported by the Cambridge Arts Council. And in this project, we have brought together 7 poets and 14 scientists. And the scientists and poets work together to create poems about the scientists' lives, their histories, the science that they produce. And these poems are then printed alongside and presented alongside their portraits of the scientists. And the portraits are created by a local photographer, Vanessa Leroy, who I'll also present. And they've been exhibited at Mass General Cancer Center, as well as in the lobby of Mass General, with the People's Heart support. And this is just the most recent exhibition that Kai is speaking to. So it just gives you an idea of the of what the project produced. So with that said, I'd like to introduce our panelists. So first is Charles Coe. He is the author of 3 books of poetry and author of Spin Cycles, a novella published by Gamma Media. Charles was selected as a Boston Literary Light by the Associates of the Boston Public Library and is a former artist fellow at the St. Botolph Club in Boston. He was a 2017 artist in residence for the city of Boston, where he created an oral history of project focusing on residents of Mission Hill. Charles has served as poet in residence at Wheaton College and at the sorry, I'm going to mispronounce this, Chautauqua Institution in state New York, and is an adjunct professor of English at Salve Regina University in Newport, Rhode Island, and Bay Path University, where he teaches in both MFA programs. Our other poet is Luisa Fernanda Apolea Torres, and she's a Peruvian-born Los Angeles-raised poet. She, in high school, her English teacher insisted that she participate in a poetry out loud competition. That's when she first savored the intrigue of words and paused on her tongue and the inexplicable joy that stemmed from that. She studied mechanical engineering and theater at MIT. Her poetry is inspired by an assortment of things from her daily life, from trees to Arduinos to inexplicable dichotomies. She's also recipient of the Leah and Jerome B. Weisner Student Art Award at MIT. Vanessa Leroy is a Boston-based photographer. She holds a BFA in photography from the Massachusetts College of Art and Design, and she remains on the hunt for new ways of seeing, remembering, and altering the world through photography. She is drawn to image making because of the power it holds to create nuanced representation for marginalized people and uplift their stories. She sees photography as a tool for social justice, and with it, she hopes to create worlds that people feel as they can enter and draw from, as well as provide a look into experience that they may not personally recognize. Her work has been featured in the New York Times most recently, the Washington Post, NPR, Stat News, Bloomberg, and exhibited at the Gallery Caiaphas in Boston, where she is represented. Daniel, can you please pronounce your last name for me?
Chande.
Daniel Chande, although he's the executive director of People's Heart, he's also one of the participants in the Poetry of Science. So Daniel Chande is a graduate from MIT, having a degree in physics, and he subsequently pursued his PhD in physics through the Harvard Graduate School of Arts and Sciences with a joint degree from MIT in medical engineering and medical physics. Following his PhD, he attended Harvard Medical School. He did his intern year at Signature Health Brockton Hospital and is a current resident in Massachusetts General Hospital Radiology Department. He is the executive director of the People's Heart, a joint community healthcare initiative aimed at addressing healthcare disparities through art and design. His research interests focusing on using art as a tool to build empathy and better understanding the patient experience. So we have a rather impressive array of panelists here in front of us. And if we can, I'd like to ask Charles to bring us into his wonderful world of poetry and ask if you can do a poetry reading of one of the poems that you wrote with one of your participants. Sorry, collaborators.
Okay. I wasn't expecting to read one of the poems from the project, but if you give me a moment, I will dig it up. But first, I'll say something about the experience of being part of this project. I know a lot of artists who are very conversant with technology, and I know a lot of people in technology, like medicine and physics, who are also excellent musicians or artists in other fields. So these are very permeable membranes. And when I was asked to participate in the project, I really, I enjoyed the prospect of approaching, I was working with two scientists, approaching the work in a way that wasn't writing a poem about the science or the research itself, but was a way of entering the art or the spirit of the work. And in that way, I really felt in a visceral sense that connection between art and science. And I'm going to take just a moment. I can find one of the poems I did for the project.
Sure, and I can tell you who, I can introduce everyone who you're working with. So Charles was working with two scientists. One was Michael Wells. He is a developmental neurobiologist. He was at the Broad Institute, now is a professor at UCLA. And the other is so I don't misremember.
This will take me just a second.
Nandita Menon, who is a bioengineer at the Koch Institute at MIT. And each poet wrote a single poem for two of the scientists. Louisa also wrote two poems, and she worked with Shannon Johnson and with Christian Loyo. Both are, Shannon is a neuroscientist, I think a neuroengineer, and Christian is a biochemist, I believe, biologist.
Our technology, the question becomes, are we running our technology or is our technology running us? That is the eternal question. I'm having just a touch.
If you like, I can also put it on our screen if that helps.
Yeah, put it on the screen, okay. and I'll read it from there. Nandita's poem, that would be great.
Sure.
And I'll say before I read it that Nandita's work involves looking at ways of improving care to people in rural and low-income areas. And she was particularly interested in the plight of people who needed certain vaccinations for various diseases, but it was difficult for them to make multiple trips to a clinic. So she was looking at ways to develop vaccines that could be delivered in one dose, so people didn't have to make repeated trips. And so I'm going to, this is kind of small on the screen. Okay, I think I can make this work. So this is Under the Eucalyptus Tree. A young mother walking to the clinic sits on a bench to rest in the shade on this hot and dusty day. She has taken off the sling in which she carries her young child, laid it on the bench beside her while quietly humming some song her mother once sang to her. Could you scroll down? Her child dozes fitfully. Hot with the fever, her mother's special tea could not break. And she wipes the sweat from his face with a damp cloth. When she began this journey, mother had frowned and said, "I do not trust the people in that place with their pills and their machines. The old ways are best." Mother and her husband had not wanted to hear about the nurse who had come to their village to speak of the clinic, had not wanted to hear about the calm gaze and quiet, reassuring voice, had simply stood a long moment in the doorway, faces carved in stone, then turned to disappear into the little house. Now, finally, the young mother sees the clinic just a little way up the road. She gathers her resolve, takes a deep breath, and rises from the bench, whispering a short prayer of thanks to the eucalyptus tree that granted her this moment of rest and shade, and perfumed the breeze with hints of mint and honey.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I would also say that one of the things that was interesting about the process was I don't believe any of us just said, oh yeah, we had a conversation with our scientists, and then we went up and wrote this poem, and then when we were done, we say, hey, here's your poem. There was a conversation that really generated your sense of how to enter the work. And I know that we were all very respectful of the scientists we were working with, and we all wanted to make sure that they were part of the process, so that when the poem was completed, they felt a sense of inclusion, and that it was almost a collaborative effort to come up with the work.
Yeah, and that's something I wanted to address in general. You know, since you're working with two scientists who have very deep knowledge about very specific things, how did you set it up such that you found the path you wanted to navigate, or find the threads you were going to pull on? I guess a more specific question is, what did you do to prepare?
Well, you're looking for an entry point. It's like you might be, if you're doing journalism and you're interviewing a person, and you're looking for the way in. You're looking for that moment that makes you go, whoa. Like Vanessa, when you're looking to photograph a person or a situation, you're scanning the environment for the thing that catches your eye, that speaks to you in some way. And it's the same thing when you're talking with the people you're going to be writing a poem with, that you're listening, and they're talking about their research, and then they say a thing that catches your ear, and you go, oh, that's it. That's the way in. That's the way in.
With Michael and Nandita, some of the poets chose very particular aspects of the scientific work that the researchers do, and then use that to pivot into the poetry. Your poem with Nandita, and somewhat similar with Michael's, has a more of a holistic feel to it, and gives you an impression about who they are as people and their experiences. The way the project was set up was such that the poets and the scientists can work together to either talk about the science, or their motivations, or their background, their histories. There was no particular rules about what the poem had to be on. I didn't have to directly translate from poetry into science. So I'm wondering, like, how did you feel about asking particular questions about their scientific work, or how was their reception to you and getting to know them? What was that back and forth like?
Well, it was a conversation. You know, it's like two people sitting around a coffee table, sipping the hot, refreshing beverage of their choice, and they're just talking about what they do. And of course, the focus was on what the scientists did. It wasn't I'll tell you, it's a 50-50 conversation, half about me and half about you. No, it's like 75 or 80% about them. But there was no, I didn't go in with a particular decision about how I was going to approach it. After talking with Nandita, that as you say, holistic, sort of impressionistic approach to the work seemed to make sense to me. And when I was working with my other poet, I focused on one specific aspect of the technology of his work, and that became the through line. So it, as they say, you use the tool for the job.
Yeah. Turning to Vanessa and the photos that you created, which are beautiful. I reached out to you in part because I was familiar with one of your pieces at a gallery exhibition that I went to that you were at, and which drove me to your site. And I was like, oh, you're perfect for this project. And I'm so glad that you agreed to be part of it. And for this project, I'm wondering, I'm going to show some of these images as you answer some of the questions. I'm wondering if you can just give us some insight into your general process, like why you chose the location, how do you interact with the scientists or your subjects in general, and what do you do to get to know either the person you're interacting with, or did the poetry affect your images in creating them?
Yeah, so I was contacted by you, I guess like kind of mid-May, sort of the beginning of May. And you contacted me about, reaching out to these scientists and like, setting up some meetings with them, and then also photo sessions to take their photographs for this project. And immediately when I heard, what the project was about, I was completely in. And upon talking to each of them over Zoom and thinking about what was logistically easiest for me to do, because I had about 2 weeks to photograph everyone, because I was going to be going to Atlanta at the beginning of June. And so I wanted to choose one place, somewhere that was like embedded in nature, because, when I think of science, the first thing I think about in terms of making portraits of all these scientists is embedding them into nature. Because with the work that all of them do, which is like, it's a huge variety. They're like all embedded in different like parts of the sciences, but essentially it's all about, helping people, helping them flourish, alleviating pain, innovation in the sciences. So that just makes me think to like nature and like, the spring that was happening. So logistically, I was like, okay, like what's one place I think where I can take everyone to that is easy enough for me to get to with my huge cart of like photo supplies, like on public transportation. And, that is just like big enough that there are so many places I can take each of them to so that the portraits look different for everyone and truly showcase their essence. So we went to the Arnold Arboretum at Harvard University. We went to the Jamaica Plain portion of, or was it maybe it was the Boston entrance, but I met them at the Arboretum, and I would just, talk to them basically about what they do. Specifically like, what their jobs are, whether they're still in school or not. And a lot of the session consisted of, talking and walking around and actually finding the spot where we were going to photograph. So basically, as Charles said, I would scan the area depending on what they were wearing, what their hair looked like, and just seeing which spot would suit them the best. Because most of all, like, I wanted them to feel comfortable. I was like, wear whatever you want. And then I will, I'll just work with what I'm brought, basically. And so as we would walk around, I'd be like, okay, this is the place. Let's stop here. I would bring some of them to maybe 1 or 2 places, but usually I would just, go with what I'm feeling, go with where the sun is leading us. And I would take them to that place, and I would direct them a lot of the time if they felt uncomfortable in front of the camera, but most of them had an idea of, how they wanted to be pictured. And I would say in the making of the photographs, I really just wanted to showcase, I guess, the essence or the feeling that I was getting from them as I got to know them for the brief time that we were together. I would love to say that, I was able to, make these images based on like, what they would tell me about the various jobs that they do. But because at the end of the day, I'm an artist, I'm not a scientist, so I couldn't even conceptualize so much of what they were explaining to me about like the nuances like of their jobs and all of the details. So I was like, okay, I'm going to have to just, stick to the kind of just like knowledge I have, of art in general, like how I'm going to construct these images.
Yeah, I'm, as a scientist myself and as a photographer, it is interesting. Like, there's not a direct translation between the two, but you can pick up on some of the ideas through the imagery itself. And I think you picked up on a lot of it, whether conscious or not, and in the poetry as well. And particularly in this photo, Kathleen. I have to look up the actual poem here.
That was another thing about making these images. A lot of these were made before the poems were created for the pieces. So I didn't have the poems to work with at the time. So I really just had to work based off of the environment.
Yeah, it was fortuitous. There was an actual line in one of the stanzas about being in a next to some flowers curled upon her. And so it fit very well. But yeah, the images are absolutely amazing, and people have had such a positive response to them. And you know, you're a fine art photographer yourself, and you've won some pretty significant awards with your own personal work. And you're also a professional photographer for news agencies, and you get jobs that way. So, you know, this is not your personal project, but it's part of a larger art project. So I'm wondering, you're kind of in between in this particular project. So I don't know if you can give any insights about how that was for you, and how kind of your personal work kind of comes through, I don't know, conceptually or emotionally or in some way through this project.
Oh yeah. So in my personal work, environmental portraiture is a large presence within a lot of my work. I do a lot of self-portraiture, portraits of my friends or my family, usually based within nature, kind of just, you know, looking at like the human form within nature, contrasting with nature. And so I was already very much in my element when it came to making these photographs. And it was interesting because usually it was with people I was close to that I was making these portraits of. So I was meeting all of these scientists for the first time. But there was kind of an immediate sense of comfort because, like, you know, we were both meeting each other, you know, with the intention of creating something pretty cool, pretty unique for this project, and like also meeting them with the intention of knowing that like I'm here to like, you know, make you feel comfortable in front of the camera and to kind of just help you, you know, tell your story visually, you know, in this really cool concept. So yeah, it was kind of an extension of the way that I already worked, but it was able to kind of push me further into taking portraits of others and helping to showcase their essence.
Well said. That's absolutely beautifully done. It creates so much more power in a different dimension. Kind of pivoting to Luisa for a little bit. You know, you're in a unique place in terms of geography and in terms of your ability as a scientist and as a poet, as someone who's in theater. Before we got on to the public call, you're talking about how you're in Peru and you're thinking and speaking in Spanish mostly right now, and you brought up translating and how that's important in communicating in general, even I guess within your own language, in your own community. But I'm wondering what it was like for you as someone with an engineering background, strong engineering background, and having to take science courses, what it was like working with scientists, you know, a biologist and someone who has a neuroengineering background in creating your poetry.
Yeah. How the experience was very personal. I think throughout the project, working with my scientist, Christian, we started off the conversation with very immediately becoming very personal, I think, because we come from very similar backgrounds, and that kind of guided most of our work together. Think I actually felt more like a poet than a scientist throughout the process as well, to answer kind of that like thing of being part of both worlds. Because he's a biologist and I have very little idea of what biology sounds like and looks like and works, aside from a general institute requirement I had to take in biology. So a lot of what he tried to explain to me was foreign in a lot of ways. So I kind of then relied and focused on that personal shared story that we had gone through. And in our case, it was growing up in a family where there was a whole immigrant context, coming from families that had these dreams for us and provided little things for us to dream around which was in his case, the plastic red microscope. And that really touched me. And I think on that note as well, I think a poet's context is very important when they're writing their poem, at least for me in that moment. I was in my last semester at MIT and I was feeling very stressed and very worried about life in general, and focusing on that plastic red microscope that he shared was powerful and grounding, and kind of reminded me of what all this was for. So I feel really grateful to have shared that experience with him, and talked through that while we worked on the poem together. And I echo a lot of what Charles said about working with the scientist. It was the first time that I actually wrote a poem for someone else, for someone else's story. And I felt a really big responsibility for that. And at the same time, it was very enjoyable to do that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of that kind of heartfelt and like lovely connection comes through in your piece. You can, I don't know, first, I mean, the poetry what resonates with me as well. And I think a lot of that can come through like in like the red telescope, personally. If you have the piece available with you, are you able to read it?
Yeah. Let's do it. Should I share my screen as well, or? Yep.
I think that can help because the people can read along.
Okay. Awesome. Looking. A summer in Minnesota. My furrowed forehead lines glinted in the sun. A jagged hairline rebelliously keeping drops of sweat from falling into my lap, and knees squatting so close to the playground cement, and my hands cradled a red plastic microscope. A red telescope for tiny things. It was a gift from my mom. She ordered it from a school catalog for me. A splash of color, it stood out against my worn graphic t-shirt, and my eyebrows furrowed again. The sun's light reflected from the small mirror inside, illustrating beings, speaking to me from plastic slides like large lungs from a cat and a small liver from a pig, living, gifting me snapshots of their insides, squinting. What is this world smaller than my own? A winter in Minnesota. The heat inside the school building greeted my family like a saludo, a warm and accepting embrace. But then I felt their eyes. Their eyes, I noticed around us, frozen stares nitpicking, white heads furrowing as if to hide their lasers, boring holes into our souls, poking mercilessly at ourselves. Why? Was my softly brown skin marking me for inspection? Did it become the plastic slide that contained me, that they'd hold up against the sky to see if my lungs and my liver were the same as theirs? A green checkbox of approval. Yes, you're good. You are not like them. An autumn in Minnesota. Click, blink, click, click, blink. I stare tiredly at black scratches on the laptop screen, frowning at the little red squiggly line marking my last name as wrong, like always. Click, 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 send, and that's it. That's one more pair of eyes on me, hopefully. What if they don't read it? What if they walk past my orange petals, stretching relentlessly towards the sun, growing fiercely, yelling loudly amidst louder arboretum colors and swirls of distracting perfect autumn leaves? Would they stop and grant me 1 second under their microscope and appreciate details ingrained into my stubborn stem, beautiful thorns lining the edges of my leaves like stationery, telling stories of little steps. Give me 1 second. Let the sun shine through me for 1 second. My inbox startles me. Yes, let's meet. I rest against the chair behind me and close my eyes. Thank you.
That's lovely. I don't know. I don't know if anyone else has experiences with this, but directing something and having to organize 20 plus people and dealing with funding and some personalities, it can get in the way of enjoying art. And so when you have a moment to actually take a step back and then hear it and reflect on it and see it, is very worth it. And you realize, oh, this is the space that was created in order to have this. And thank you. I really appreciate that.
Well, Joshua, we all appreciate your ability to herd cats in this particular context.
No herding cats, really. It was effortful. Thank you so much. I'd like to ask Daniel some questions. Daniel is also an additional amazing person. I mean, so you have a theater background, Daniel, right, at MIT as well, and you have a physics background, a healthcare background, and you're interested in how art can be incorporated into the literal context and how that might shape your patient's recovery, as I understand it. And with all of that, as a participating scientist researcher in the poetry of science and working with your poet, Danielle Legros Georges, I'm wondering how it was as the scientist seeing yourself being reflected in a piece of art or in the poem, and what your general experience was like.
Sure. It was interesting as a scientist in this experience. Obviously, we have very little engagement in the arts. So when I saw the flyer looking for people to submit or to nominate themselves or submit their stories, I figured, sure, why not? I talked about what I did, which, as you pointed out, is actually exploring the use of art and design as a tool to address health equity. And meeting with Danielle, a lot of our meetings just focused around the trajectory, right? How moving from child interested in math and science to college student to PhD student, then med student, then, doctor, and what that experience was like both as a Black man, but more in the larger sense as a human being. And, I always take like a very hands-off approach on people creating art. I don't want to tell people how it should be made or kind of like force an outcome. I guess an allegory would be, if I'm at a bar and I order a beer and I don't like the taste of the beer, I'm never going to send it back, right? Because that beer is that beer that I have at that point in time in a whole lifetime of beers. And so I can appreciate it for what it is. It's that beer at that moment. And I have to say, I was blown away by what ended up coming out of our conversations, because we spent so much time trying to understand one another and kind of come to some higher level of experience that the children's poem that she wrote, I thought was incredibly lovely and moving and really focused on both the kind of, I like to think, the childlike joy that I have, but in the broader sense, like inspiration for the next generation, which I felt was one of the major goals of this project. So I was like, yeah, man, that's perfect.
Yeah, you're very like a flexible, creative person, and you know, when you can see both sides, I think, pretty well. And one thing that came out in some of the interviews that I did with the pairs of scientists and researchers is the idea of structure. Who is setting up what? So it wasn't known to us beforehand who was going to help drive what. And it turns out that it was really the poets that were setting up the, that were essentially outlining the initial creative, I don't know what to call it, like structure. And the scientists were just kind of like, okay, well, what's up? What's going on? So at first I thought it would be the scientists because they seem to be more structured in terms of like logical thinking. But that was just a very crude idea that I had. So as someone who kind of comes at it from both directions, I don't know if you had any insight into what it's like to structure these types of creative interactions between you know, researchers or those who are in the arts.
Yeah, no, great question. So obviously there's many outcomes that can come from how you structure who is driving what. Something I found very interesting, at least in my personal experience, was the fact that it very quickly became a conversation, and one that we got lost in, you know, the metaphysical and theoretical discussion of the work that I do. But keep in mind, that's because the work I was currently discussing was, you know, the intersection of art, identity, and health, right? If I had talked to her about the work I had done before, which was simultaneous positron emission tomography and magnetic resonance imaging, it probably would have been a whole different conversation. But, you know, because it was something where we were both kind of on this, in this creative space, it kind of lent itself to these discussions. Now, kind of on the more broader question that you were asking, how setting these things up can be challenging or yield different results. As a scientist, we're always question focused, right? If given a question, we will break that question down into multiple steps. We will accomplish each of those steps, come to an outcome, and then come up with a likely answer for that question. Hopefully using some sort of statistics to say that it may not be the only answer, but it is the most likely or most probable answer. However, so I work in the health equity space, right? So I spend most of my days thinking about how do we get underserved communities, which are predominantly communities of color, to engage with health, right? Or at least the Western hospital health that we can provide at Mass General Brigham, and beyond. Now, in that case, it's a different story, right? The other thing I do is I work on creating environments that are more inclusive and that are empowering to patients from these underserved communities. And to do that, we have to teach staff empathy. And that's very different from a scientific question, right? And these are things that art are much better formed to handle, right? I can't explain empathy to someone logically, right? There's no way that I can design an experiment to instill empathy in someone. However, through exploration of self and others, like that's how you do it, right? It's like Louisa's poem when she mentions how it underlines the scientist's name, right? And as a Black guy with the last name Chande, like that gets me instantly. I'm connected to that, right? There's no like hardware I can design. There's no software I can design. There's no system I can build that is going to force someone to make that connection to me or some experience like Luisa's words can. And so as scientists, it's very easy for us to, by default, take a back seat to that space because it's so alien to us. But as a creative, right, that's where you all lead the charge, and you all are the future of health equity and the future of creating societies that are inclusive and empower all people.
Yeah, well said. Taking a step back but also generally getting to what you're saying about what does it mean to understand empathy, but not through a logical discussion, I guess. One thing that the project focuses on is just understanding different perspectives, granted primarily from the scope of people of color, but understanding how different groups can build coalition, even though they come from different perspectives, and maybe they don't share the same language, but in order to build coalition, you have to actually come and see where you overlap and how you discuss things and where the overlapping themes are, essentially, to figure out how you can essentially build momentum to make change. That's not explicitly stated, but that's one of the goals. So in the creative process, whether it's in the arts or in the sciences, I personally found there to be so many similarities in my own work and looking at it between, let's say, fine art photography and the sciences. And one thing that I keep on telling myself is something like that I've learned in like thermodynamics. You know, energy can neither be created nor destroyed. Right? You can only kind of transfer. And I see myself translating photography into science, or science back into photography, and vice versa. So I'm just wondering for the whole group, like, what your ideas are about what does it mean to be creative and translating that creativity into any other system or any other language or any other modes of thought or being. Because if we're completely siloed in our own unique branch of whatever we're doing, like being in an apartment or being, you know, wearing one hat, then if we can't translate it into another thing, we're not going to be able to solve hard problems. So what does it mean to be creative and translating that creativity?
I would say personally, right, I'm a thief, right? I steal from art and I create interventions based on that. I create ways in which that we can use art as a tool to bring people into our healthcare spaces or to kind of connect them to care. So I am always looking for, you know, creative ways in which we can change that care experience, which is why, you know, I found this project so interesting and exciting. And I was immediately thinking, right, how we think about first responders, right? When we were in the middle of COVID, everyone was focused on, oh, first responders. But then when we think about who are these first responders, right? Yes, sure, they're the doctors, the nurses who were given food from restaurants as kind of like a thank you, but those grocery stores, right? Everyone who worked in a grocery store, they were a first responder. They were, what did we call these people? Vital necessary workforce, right? The people who keep our cars running, vital workforce. Anyone who had to go to work. And how do we thank them? Well, we cram them on buses, right? if they don't have cars. So I was thinking, like, some way this art gave so much dignity to these scientists. What if that same thing was done with, we want to give that same level of dignity to everyone. And so that's what this project inspired me to do and to kind of explore how we can accomplish that. So That's my piece.
Bonji. No, to follow up on something you just said, Dan, a little earlier about empathy. It's interesting because that's the artist's stock in trade. What we're trying to do is encourage people to understand what it's like to be another person. And you said that in your profession, in the medical profession, that can be a challenge because people aren't comfortable always or encouraged to enter that realm. Do you remember a movie that came out in the early 90s with William Hurt? It was called The Doctor. And he was a doctor who was the stereotype of the arrogant, self-involved, unsympathetic doctor. But he had some stuff going on in his life that sort of cracked his shell. And as he started to understand more about being a human being, one of the things he did with the interns he was training was he had them come to the hospital, take off their clothes, put on hospital gowns, and spend the night as an inpatient and experience everything that an inpatient experiences, all the vulnerability and the fear. I had emergency gallbladder surgery on presidential election day. And I have a piece coming out about that in the Lowell Review next month, just for the record. But I start the essay by saying that the first thing you surrender when you are hospitalized for something serious is your sense of boundaries around your own body. The vulnerability is like nothing you've ever experienced. And if you're in the profession and you're dealing with people all the time, even though you see them going through that, sometimes there's a disconnect and you're not empathizing with them. So everything that you can do to steal from the realm of art to still, I like to steal from the realm of art to bring that same sense of empathy and sympathy and sympathetic understanding to your profession, all praise and honor.
I think on that same note, and also maybe a tangent, Josh, when you said thermodynamics, I jumped because all I remember in thermodynamics is sitting there and thinking about the first law and thinking about how it's such a wonderful poem. It was very distracting, and I did not do very well on that exam. Because I think I always was drawn to science for the fact that it seemed like a way to connect what I saw outside of myself to another part of our lives, which I think is the human experience. And I think things like the physical world telling us that one type of energy is transferred to another type of energy can be felt and be seen by artists when we exchange words, when we exchange images, photography, conversations. I think energy is something that I think for me as an artist is very intuitive and metaphysical. So when you say transferring creativity from one end to another, I think empathy is part of that. I think thinking about the world as one shared experience, maybe through energy, is another part of that. Yeah, that just reminded me of all those times I would write poetry on the edges of my thermodynamics book. It was very distracting. And I would try to explain it to my friends and they'd be like, why are you writing poetry in thermodynamics? But it was just, a tangent.
But an interesting point.
I resonate with a lot of what you've just said, because in my experience, what I've come to realize is that when I'm taking images, sometimes the least, or well, actually most of the time, the least important part of the process is the camera, and the most important part is the shared experience that you're having with the person that you're photographing, the community that you're building by telling these stories, and the way that you're able to reach the viewer through like the trust that's built between you and whoever you're photographing. So it's kind of, I really have found photography to be like such a spiritual experience, because it's not the camera that's the most important part, but it's everything that you're drawing from, all of the experiences you've had up until that point, everything that you've learned up until that point, what you're learning about, you know, what you're photographing or who you're photographing, all of that contributing to the making of the images, and all of that contributing to making the image able to be felt by whoever is viewing it, or like, you know, all of that contributing to opening up the image so that you can walk into it and understand what you're seeing, understand the context, be a part of that story, have it mirror something inside of you, or maybe you're just looking at something that you may not recognize, but now it's something that you won't necessarily like forget, because now it's shaping how you will view things after that point. So yeah.
And Vanessa, when you look at your photographs, this is the only of your work I've seen, but I'm sure it's a quality that is everywhere in your work. If you're taking a picture of a building or a car or a tree, that certainly takes a certain kind of eye and skill and compositional vision, et cetera, et cetera. But when you're taking pictures of people, as you say, you have to bring so much more to the party. You're kind of the person whisperer, because a lot of people are not comfortable having their pictures taken, especially in a formal setting. So to create the ease and in all of those pictures, people were completely inhabiting their bodies. There was no distance, there was no wall, there was no reserve or sense of discomfort. And to me, that's a kind of poetry in itself.
I love
We actually
that.
have a question as well from the audience.
Well said.
And this question comes from Vanessa, I don't know, for Vanessa. And if you were going, we did this in an interesting way where the pictures were taken and the poems were created not necessarily in conjunction with one another. But if you were to focus more on the lines of the poems, how do you think that would have changed the images you made?
That's certainly, so if I had the poems to work off of, that definitely may have made a difference in the way I went about making the images, because for a lot of my personal work, a lot of the work is derived from books that I've read, two in particular, one being Beloved by Toni Morrison, and the other being Kindred by Octavia Butler. And so oftentimes I'll take text directly from the books and add them into my work, or I will just, you know, kind of take what I've read and metaphorically like infuse it into my work. So I'm sure that if I had had the poems to read from before making the images, I definitely probably would have drawn from certain words and maybe, you know, use that as inspiration for like where we would go, or like how I would have that appear in the image. But because I didn't have that, I just drew from the environment, from who I was with, the energy I was getting, what they looked like, you know, hair, clothes, and then I just went from there. But I'm certain that if I had had the poems to work from, there probably would have been, I would have tried to incorporate that into the images.
It is hard to imagine how the photos could have been better.
Maybe a little different, but not better, certainly.
Right. Those are the questions I had for our panelists today. I don't know if you had anything else, Daniel, on your end.
No, I mean, unless you know how to convince large hospital systems and society at large to pay attention to underserved communities. I would happily steal that information from you. But no, I mean, this has been a pleasure, pleasure talking with you all, learning from you. This, of course, is recorded and will be posted on YouTube for those participant or those audience members who either had work now or other engagements, and will live on and hopefully inspire a whole new selection of art and art interventions in the future.
I'd like to just say that I was very happy to be part of something to put a spotlight on Black scientists, because sort of the invisible 500-pound gorilla in this conversation is the fact that a lot of people in the dominant culture don't get and don't respect often Black scientists and technicians in a particular way. I have a friend, a Black man who is an anesthesiologist in another city, and he told me that there have been times that he's had patients, sometimes Black patients, go to the head honcho and say that they weren't comfortable working with a Black anesthesiologist. So the beat goes on, same stuff, different century, which is why, and this is a little bit of a tangent, then I'll say this and I'll step off, why I was so thrilled when Hidden Figures hit the screens, because it transformed so many people's ideas, white people and Black people, about what Black people could do, and particularly Black women could do as scientists. That was just that was a thrilling experience to watch that. And I had read the book before I saw the film, so I was definitely ready to go. So I'm so glad that this project has really put the spotlight on talented Black scientists. It's long overdue.
All right.
Yes,
Thank
I think
you all.
on my end, I think on that note too, I want to thank Josh for all his amazing work, and all the logistical support throughout this whole process. And everyone here, shout out to the Latino Cultural Center at MIT, the BSU, who do amazing work in creating inclusive communities on campus. I think the work that our generation and people at MIT are doing to do this for the new generation is truly amazing and selfless. So thank you all for everything.
Yeah, thank you for all the poets, all the scientists, everyone at MGH who helped us get up the show. Kai, MIT, Vanessa, Linsey, who couldn't be here, who's the my partner in crime for putting up the this entire project. It's been truly amazing year plus project. It's awesome.
All right. Thank you all. And we return tomorrow with a whole new day of programming.